Ever just stop and think, why is anything here in the first place? I mean, science tells us how things work, how they came to be, but what about the big why? Today, we're taking a deep dive into some, well, truly mind-bending philosophical arguments that tackle this ultimate question, the existence of an ultimate reality. We're pulling insights from an authoritative text on the subject, and our goal is really to give you the most important takeaways from these complex ideas, quick and clear.
That's right. Our aim is to provide you with a structured understanding of these profound philosophical proofs. We'll explore what they imply about the very nature of reality. And we'll also see how they skillfully, anticipate and address common objections. It's a journey into truly understanding some foundational questions designed to give you that well-informed edge.
Yeah, think of it as a shortcut, maybe. A shortcut to grasping some of humanity's deepest inquiries, but with surprising clarity and practical understanding. Get ready for some serious aha moments that might just shift your perspective. Okay, let's unpack this then. The text lays out 5 distinct arguments. Each one starts from a different observable aspect of the world we experience. And what's truly striking is that they all seem to lead to a remarkably similar conclusion about an ultimate reality. We won't go into, every single detail of all 5 right now, but we'll definitely highlight the core insights from a few that really drive the point home.
Absolutely. Let's start with the Aristotelian proof. This one begins with something we all witness daily, change. Just think about a glass of hot coffee cooling down or a seed growing into a tree. Things go from a state of potential to a state of actuality.
Right, potential to actual, like potential heat to actual coolness.
Exactly. And the profound insight here is that nothing can move itself from potential to actual. Change always requires something else to bring about that change. A coffee cup doesn't cool itself, right? And a seed doesn't become a tree without sunlight and water and soil.
Other things acting on it?
Precisely. So if everything that changes is changed by something else, you can't have an infinite chain of changers just going back forever. There must be an ultimate unmoved mover, or as the text calls it, a purely actual actualizer, something that causes change without itself having any potential that needs actualizing. Change requires a changer, and that chain has to end somewhere.
That makes sense. It's like saying you can't just have dominoes falling endlessly. Someone or something had to push the first one. Okay, what's another key perspective?
Well, then there's the Neo-Platonic proof. This one starts with the observation that the things we experience are composite. Your phone, for instance, it's a composite of glass, metal, plastic, circuits. It's made of parts.
Right, lots of parts.
The core idea here is that anything made of parts isn't inherently existing on its own. It depends on something beyond those parts to bring them together and give the whole thing existence. If something is put together, it needs a cause that puts it together. This leads us to the need for an absolutely simple or non-composite cause, a fundamental reality that isn't itself made of parts.
Because if it were made of parts,
then we'd be back to needing something to put it together, and that would be an endless regress. It wouldn't be the ultimate explanation.
So if it has parts, it relies on something else for its existence. Yeah. And if it's truly ultimate, it can't have parts. That's a powerful idea. And how does the Thomistic proof approach this?
The Thomistic proof. It's fascinating because it hinges on a distinction within pretty much everything we encounter. The difference between a thing's essence, what is like humanness or chairness, and its existence. That it is the fact that this human or this chair actually exists.
Okay, what's versus that?
Exactly. For any created thing, its essence is distinct from its existence. You can understand the essence of a unicorn, being a horse with a horn, but that doesn't mean unicorns exist.
Right. I can define it, but it doesn't make it real.
Precisely. So, since a thing's essence doesn't guarantee its existence must be imparted to it, given to it, by something else. This points to an ultimate cause whose very essence is existence. It's not something that has existence as a property, but something that simply is existence itself.
Wow. Okay, so we're talking about something that is not just a cause, but a foundational reality whose very nature is existence itself.
Yeah.
Deep. The text also mentions the Augustinian proof, right? Dealing with abstract concepts like numbers, and the Rationalist proof tied to the principle of sufficient reason. What's the big takeaway from all these different starting points?
The striking thing really is the convergence. Each of these proofs, starting from different everyday observation, whether it's the cooling of coffee, the components of a chair, the truth of 2 + 2 = 4, or just the fact that things exist when they don't have to, they all ultimately point towards the same underlying ultimate reality, a foundational source for everything else.
That's a powerful convergence, all right. But okay, how do we bridge the gap? How do we get from these pretty abstract philosophical ideas of a first cause or subsistent existence itself to something we might recognize as, say, God as traditionally conceived with specific attributes? What does this ultimate reality actually do or be? You mentioned the author introduces 3 essential philosophical tools that help connect these dots.
Absolutely. These are crucial for moving forward. The first is the principle of proportionate causality, often just called PPC. This principle states that whatever is in an effect must, in some sense, pre-exist in its total cause. Now, it's not just about material parts. The cause could contain the effect virtually or eminently.
Okay, what does virtually or eminently mean here?
Right. Think of it this way. The sponginess of a cake wasn't physically present in the raw flour or eggs, was it? But the potential for that sponginess was there, given the nature of the ingredients in the process. It emerged through the complex chemical changes produced by the combined cause. The ingredients, the recipe, the heat, the mixing, that sort of virtual pre-existence.
Yeah.
Eminent means the cause possesses a quality in a higher, more perfect way. Like an intelligent architect has the form of the house in their mind eminently before it exists materially. Even in science, we assume this. We assume the properties of water come from its constituent hydrogen and oxygen, or the conditions allowing them to bond. The cause must be adequate to produce the effect.
Got it. So the cause has to have, in some way, what it gives to the effect. That seems pretty foundational for understanding how this ultimate reality relates to everything else. What's the next tool?
The second tool is a Latin phrase, but the concept is simple. Agere sequitur esse. It means action follows being. This is fundamental. It basically states that what something is dictates how it acts or behaves. A thing's nature determines its operations.
Like a bird flies because it is a bird, with wings and instincts for flight.
Exactly. A bird flies because it is a bird with the nature of flight. A rock falls because it is a rock, subject to gravity.
Mm-hmm.
So, to understand what something does or what attributes it might have, you first have to understand what it fundamentally is.
Mm-hmm.
This principle helps us deduce the attributes of the ultimate reality from its nature as, say, the purely actual first cause.
Okay, action follows being. Makes sense. And the third tool is about how we can even talk about this ultimate reality, right? Given how radically different it sounds from anything we know.
Precisely. That's the analogy of being.
Yeah.
This is really important. It helps us understand how we can use words to describe God, who is, by definition, radically different from creatures like us.
Yeah.
Words can be used univocally, meaning in the exact same sense. Like when I say Rover is a dog and Saito is a dog means the same thing. Or they can be used equivocally, meaning in completely different senses, like bank meaning the side of a river and bank meaning a financial institution. No real connection. But there's a crucial middle ground, analogical use. Here, terms are related, but not identical in meaning. Think about when we say, this wine is good, George is a good man. The goodness isn't exactly the same, is it? But it's meaningfully related. Both imply a certain kind of perfection or fulfilling a purpose. This is how we speak about God. His being or wisdom or goodness is analogous to ours. It's related, but infinitely more perfect and ultimately beyond our full grasp. It means we can say something true about God without fully comprehending him or, reducing him to our level.
That's a critical point for making sense of all this. It allows us to talk meaningfully without claiming complete understanding. Okay, so armed with these proofs and these principles, proportionate causality, action follows being, an analogy, we can start to piece together a picture of this ultimate reality. What are some of the key attributes we can deduce about what the text refers to as God?
Indeed. We can infer several key attributes based on the conclusions of the proofs, especially things like being pure actuality or absolute simplicity. First, unity. There is, and in principle can be, only one such ultimate reality. Because this being is purely actual and simple, meaning without parts, there's nothing that could possibly differentiate one ultimate being from another. If there were two, they'd have to differ by some feature, right?
Yeah, like one has feature X and the other doesn't.
Exactly.
Right.
But having a feature or lacking it implies some kind of composition, some complexity, maybe a potentiality, and that contradicts the nature of the ultimate cause as purely actual and simple. So uniqueness is built in.
So uniqueness is built into its very nature. And you mentioned simplicity again just now. You stressed it earlier too. How crucial is that concept?
Oh, it's absolutely crucial. Divine simplicity is, well, maybe one of the hardest but most important ideas. It means God has absolutely no parts, no separate components, no different elements mixed together, no potentiality mixed with actuality, no distinction between his essence and his existence.
No parts at all. That's hard to wrap your head around.
It is. But think of it this way. If God had parts, something would have had to put those parts together or explain why those parts belong together, which would mean he's dependent on something else and therefore not the ultimate, uncaused first cause. His simplicity is vital because it secures his ultimacy, his self-sufficiency. He doesn't rely on anything else for his existence or his nature. It also means his existence is his essence. There's simply no distinction between what he is and that he is.
Wow, okay. That's a mind-bending concept on its own. If God is truly simple and purely actual, what does that imply about his relationship with, say, time and change?
Precisely. That leads directly to immutability and eternity. Since God is purely actual, meaning he has no unrealized potentiality, he cannot change. Change is always the actualization of some potential. And because existing within time inherently involves changeability moving from one moment to the next, an immutable cause must also be eternal. Not just existing for a very long time, but existing outside of time altogether. He simply is, without beginning or end.
Outside of time, wow.
And from his immutability and eternity, his immateriality and incorporeality naturally follow. Material things, physical things, are inherently changeable. They exist within time and space. They have parts. So an immutable, eternal, simple being must be immaterial.
So this ultimate reality is outside of time, unchanging, immaterial. What about its existence itself? Is it just like lucky that it not
at all? That leads to necessity. God exists in an absolutely necessary way. Remember the Thomistic argument. His very essence is existence itself. So he cannot possibly fail to exist. His existence isn't contingent on anything. It's inherent to what he is. He's inherently uncaused and could not be.
Necessary, uncaused. Okay, what about power? Does this ultimate cause have power?
Yes, absolutely. As pure actuality and the ultimate source of all actualizing power for everything else, God necessarily possesses all possible power. We call this omnipotence. Now, it's important to clarify what this means. It doesn't mean he can do things that are self-contradictory, like making a round square. Such things aren't real possibilities. They're just meaningless combinations of words. That's not a limitation on his power. It's just a reflection of logic.
So he can do anything that is intrinsically possible.
Exactly. Similarly, the text argues he cannot sin, because the idea of a perfectly good being choosing evil is seen as a contradiction in terms, given his nature as maximal perfection.
So power, yes, but always consistent with his own nature and logic. That makes sense. What about his knowledge? Does this being know things?
Yes, omniscience. Remember the Augustinian proof. It argued that abstract objects, universals like redness, mathematical truths, propositions exist ultimately as ideas in a divine intellect. So God knows all concepts, all possible ways things could be, and all actual states of affairs, past, present, and future, though future is tricky, given Leachy learned them in. He's outside time. He knows them fundamentally by being their ultimate cause. And importantly, this knowledge isn't seen as incompatible with creaturely free will.
How does that work? Knowing without forcing.
The analogy often used is like an author who knows the story his characters will freely choose to enact within the narrative he creates. God's knowledge doesn't compel the will. It's a knowledge of the choices that are freely made, grounded in his sustaining the whole system.
Okay, that's helpful. And finally, a concept many people grapple with, especially given suffering in the world. His goodness.
Right. Perfect goodness. This is derived from his pure actuality. As the ultimate reality, God possesses maximal perfection. Goodness in this philosophical tradition isn't just a moral quality. It's linked to being, to actuality, to the fulfillment of potential. And the text makes a crucial distinction here regarding evil. Goodness is understood as a presence, the realization of inherent potentials, fullness of being. Badness or evil, however, is understood as a privation. It's an absence of a good that should be there, given the nature of the thing.
A privation. Like blindness is the absence of sight.
Exactly like that. Blindness isn't a positive thing. It's the lack of sight in a being that, by nature, ought to have sight. Rust isn't something added to metal. It's the metal's integrity being corrupted, absent. So when God creates or permits a world that includes evil, it's not seen as him positively creating bad things. Rather, he permits the absence of certain goods. Why? The text suggests this is often tied to allowing for greater goods, like genuine free will, which entails the possibility of choosing wrongly, or the development of virtues like courage, patience, and compassion, which often require a context of hardship to flourish.
That's a very different way of looking at evil, not as the thing God makes, but as a lack.
Yes, it reframes the problem significantly. It doesn't make suffering easy, but it offers a different metaphysical framework.
Okay, so we're building this really coherent picture. Unique, simple, eternal, immaterial, necessary, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good. Wow. My next question, then, is if this ultimate reality is so foundational, how does it actually interact with the world we experience day to day? Is it like a one-time creator who set things spinning, or is there a more ongoing relationship?
That's a vital question.
Mm.
And the arguments, especially the ones from contingency and composition, strongly imply an ongoing relationship. They show that nothing distinct from God, nothing composite or contingent, could continue to exist even for an instant if God were not continually sustaining it in being. This is known as divine conservation. Creation isn't just a past event like, a watchmaker building a watch and then letting it run on its own.
Right, the absentee landlord idea.
Exactly. This view rejects that. Creation is seen as an ongoing process happening at every single moment. The idea that things just keep existing on their own once created, like they have some kind of existential inertia, is seen as philosophically incoherent. Why? Because composite and contingent things, by their very nature, always require a sustaining cause now to hold their parts together or to impart existence to their essence.
So everything, this microphone, me, you, the air, relies on this continuous sustaining act every moment. That really shifts how you think about just being here.
It does. It means the existence of anything contingent is a constant act of dependence on the ultimate reality.
Okay, so God sustains things in existence. What about when things cause other things within the world, like the sun causes warmth or I push a button? Is that also part of this relationship?
Precisely. This leads to the next concept, divine concurrence. This clarifies God's role in every causal act that happens within the created order. It sort of steers between two extremes. One extreme is occasionalism, which basically says only God really causes anything, and created things are just occasions for God to act. Like fire doesn't really burn the paper, God just creates the burning effect on the occasion of fire touching paper.
That sounds like it removes real agency from things in the world.
It does, and it's generally rejected by this tradition. The other extreme is mere conservationism, where God sustains things in existence, but then they kind of operate and cause things totally independently using the powers God gave them. The concurrentist position, which this text argues for, is in the middle. It says the created things are genuine secondary causes. They have real causal power. They make real contributions to effects. Fire really does burn. You really do push the button. But they derive and exercise that power only because God concurs with their action at every moment. God's primary causality works through the secondary causality of creatures.
Can you give an analogy for that? It's a bit complex.
Sure. Think of it like you drawing a square on a chalkboard with blue chalk. You are the primary cause of the square being drawn. But the chalk is the secondary cause of the square being blue. Both causes are essential, working together for the specific effect. You couldn't get a blue square without both you and the chalk. Or maybe a parent guiding a child's hand to help them write their name. The child is genuinely making the effort, maybe even choosing the letters, but the letter wouldn't appear with that form and steadiness without the parent's hand concurrently guiding and enabling the action. God's concurrence enables the very causality of the creature.
Okay, so God sustains existence and concurs with every action. This changes how we think about pretty much everything, even what a miracle is. We often hear that phrase, miracles violate the laws of nature. But the text offers a different perspective, doesn't it?
It certainly does. That common definition of a miracle as a violation of a law of nature, which was really popularized by philosophers like David Hume, is quite problematic within this Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysical framework. Because in this view, a law of nature isn't like a cosmic traffic law imposed from outside. It's simply a description of a thing's natural tendencies or dispositions, given its essence, its esse. Water tends to flow downhill, fire tends to burn, heavy objects tend to fall. These tendencies can be blocked, or they might only manifest under certain specific conditions.
Okay, so if a law of nature is just a description of how things tend to act based on what they are, then what is a miracle if it's not a violation?
Right. Properly understood, a miracle isn't seen as a breach or violation of a law. Instead, it's typically understood in one of two ways. It could be an elevation of a thing's nature by God to perform an act beyond its natural capacities. This is sometimes called supernatural. Or it could be a suspension or withholding of a natural effect by God.
Can you give examples of those?
Sure. So for the first kind, elevation. If, hypothetically, someone were to walk on water, the idea isn't that water suddenly violates its nature of being liquid. Instead, it might be that God elevates the person's nature, giving them a temporary power beyond their normal capacity to interact with water differently. For the second kind, suspension. If fire encountered something flammable but didn't burn it, say in a biblical story like the burning bush, it's not that fire violates its nature to burn. Instead, it's understood as God refraining from conserving or concurring with the specific factors or conditions that would normally cause the burning effect in that instance. He is withholding the usual outcome.
So God isn't like breaking into the system from the outside.
Exactly. That's a key point. God is not seen as interfering from within the natural order, like another agent alongside natural causes. He is understood as being altogether outside, or better, underneath the entire order of natural causes, as the metaphysical precondition for there being any natural causes or causal power at all. In a way, the very ordinary, regular, natural course of things, the sun rising, gravity working, is the most constant and direct evidence of God's existence and action as the first cause, conserving and concurring with everything. There's a great quote in the text that captures this. Let me see if I can recall it. Yes. God cannot interfere in the universe, not because he has not the power, but because, so to speak, he has too much. To interfere, you have to be an alternative to or alongside what you are interfering with. If God is the cause of everything, there's nothing that he is alongside.
Wow. Too much power to interfere. That's a really intricate point. I can see how that might be a head scratcher for some listeners when they first encounter it. It paints a picture of God not as just a powerful entity among others, but as the very ground of being for everything. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. And with such profound topics, it's only natural for objections to arise, right? The text anticipates many of these, often arguing they fundamentally misunderstand the arguments being made. Let's try and tackle some of the most common ones you hear.
It's been good. The first one, and maybe the most common one you hear on the internet or anywhere, is if everything has a cause, then what caused God?
Right, the classic who made God question.
Right. Exactly. And the response is that this is a crucial misunderstanding, almost a straw man, of the arguments. None of the arguments presented actually state that everything has a cause. That's not the premise. Instead, they argue that things which are changeable or composite or contingent or whose essence is distinct from their existence require a cause. God, as the conclusion of these arguments, being purely actual, absolutely simple, subsistent existence itself, necessary is by definition uncaused. He doesn't need a cause, and indeed couldn't have one, given what he is. It's not presented as an arbitrary exception. It's the logical terminus the arguments themselves demand.
Okay, so the premise isn't everything needs a cause. It's more like everything that could have a cause needs one, and the ultimate reality, by definition, couldn't have one. That's a key distinction. What about another common objection, especially today with modern cosmology? People ask if the Big Bang or ideas like infinite universes or a multiverse eliminate the need for a first cause. How does the text address that?
All right, this is another frequent one, and again, it often misunderstands the type of causal series the arguments are focused on. The philosophical proofs we've discussed, particularly the Aristotelian and Thomistic ones, don't primarily depend on the universe having a definite beginning in time. They weren't necessarily arguing against an infinitely old universe, temporally speaking. They focus on what's called hierarchical causal series, chains of cause and effect happening right now, where power is derived and exercised simultaneously. Think of the hand holding a stick that moves a rock. The stick moves the rock only because the hand is moving the stick right now.
It's about simultaneous dependence, not just a sequence in time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The argument is that such a hierarchical chain, where power is derived at each step, always requires a first member that has the power inherently, that isn't deriving it from something else. It doesn't matter how long the chain is. An infinitely long paintbrush handle still can't paint unless there's a painter holding it. An infinite series of mirrors reflecting light still won't produce an image unless there's an original light source somewhere. So even if the physical universe were infinitely old, or if there were a multiverse, if all those universes or ACOCs are still contingent, they don't have to exist, and composite made of parts, they would still, right now, require an uncaused, non-composite necessary cause for their very existence and operation. The arguments are about ontological dependence, not just temporal origin.
That really reframes the entire discussion away from just who started it to what keeps it going right now.
Oh.
That's important. Okay, what about critiques from major philosophers like David Hume or Immanuel Kant regarding causality itself? They raise some serious challenges.
Yes, they did, and the text engages with them. Hume, for example, famously argued that we don't directly perceive causal connections, only constant conjunctions of events. He claimed we could conceive of things popping into existence uncaused.
Right, just imagine something appearing out of nowhere.
But the text counters this by saying that simply being able to imagine something appearing without imagining its cause is not the same thing as positively conceiving of it existing without a cause in a metaphysically coherent way. We can imagine lots of things that turn out to be logically impossible if we think through the full implications. Furthermore, our overwhelming experience supports causality. The world just doesn't seem to behave as if elephants or anything else could just pop into existence randomly. And even distinguishing between something genuinely coming into being versus merely being transported from somewhere else implicitly brings the concept of causation back into play. As for Kant, he argued that causality is a category of the mind that we impose on experience, and it only applies within the realm of possible experience, the empirical world, not to things beyond it, like a first cause.
So causality is just how our minds work, not necessarily how reality is.
That was Kant's view, yes. But the text argues back that the fundamental metaphysical principles used, like potentiality must be actualized by something already actual, are truths about being itself, not just how we happen to think. We might learn about Euclidean geometry from drawings on a page, empirical experience, but the truths of geometry apply to all possible shapes, whether we can draw them or see them or not. It also points out that physics, especially modern physics, often achieves its predictive power by abstracting away from concrete reality, focusing on mathematical structures and quantifiable relationships. It doesn't typically deal with concepts like intrinsic natures, potentiality, or final causes. So the fact that physics doesn't talk about these things doesn't mean they aren't real aspects of the world that metaphysics can investigate. Physics' silence isn't necessarily reality's silence.
Okay, so the argument is that these metaphysical principles are more fundamental than just empirical observation or the methods of physics. Speaking of physics, what about quantum mechanics, QM? You sometimes hear claims that QM disproves causality because things seem to happen randomly or indeterministically at the quantum level.
Yeah, that's another common one. Does QM's apparent indeterminism, or phenomena like quantum entanglement showing correlations without causal explanation, negate the principle of sufficient reason or the need for a cause? The text argues no. Firstly, physics, including QM, is primarily focused on mathematical description and prediction. It often abstracts away from the underlying causal powers or natures of things. As one philosopher put it, the absence of something in a representation is not the same thing as a representation of its absence from nature. Just because the QM formalism doesn't represent a specific deterministic cause for, say, radioactive decay, doesn't mean the decay is absolutely uncaused in a metaphysical sense. Radioactive decay, for example, is still an instance of something being produced or actualized. A change occurs. It may not be predictable when it occurs for a specific atom, but it's still an event rooted in the nature of the unstable nucleus. QM describes how things behave statistically, but it doesn't necessarily eliminate the underlying metaphysical need for actuality to ground potentiality. Causality, in the broader metaphysical sense, might still be operating, just not in the deterministic way classical physics assumed.
So QM describes the how at a certain level, but maybe not the ultimate why or the metaphysical grounding.
That's the thrust of the argument, yes.
Yeah.
It's a different level of explanation.
Okay. Another objection sometimes raised is that these arguments, particularly the Aristotelian one, are based on outdated science. Aristotle thought the Earth was the center and heavier objects fall faster. His physics was wrong, so isn't his metaphysics wrong too?
That's a really important objection to clarify because it involves a confusion. It confuses Aristotle's specific scientific theories, like his cosmology, his physics of motion, his biology, with his underlying philosophical or metaphysical principles. Yes, many of Aristotle's scientific theories have been completely overturned by modern science, and rightly so. Geocentrism is false. His physics of motion was largely incorrect. But his metaphysical theses, things like the distinction between potentiality and actuality, substance and accident, form and matter, the principle that change requires a cause. These are philosophical concepts. The argument is that these are actually foundational to and arguably presupposed by the very possibility of doing science in the first place. Science observes change. It assumes substances with stable properties exist. It seeks causal explanations. So rejecting Aristotle's outdated science doesn't automatically mean rejecting his foundational metaphysics.
So we need to separate the specific scientific conclusions from the underlying philosophical framework.
Precisely. The metaphysical arguments don't depend on believing the Earth is flat or that the sun goes around the Earth. They depend on analyzing concepts like change, composition, contingency, existence itself.
Got it. What about the fallacy of composition? Isn't arguing from parts needing a cause to the whole universe needing a cause an example of that fallacy? Like, just because every brick in a wall is small doesn't mean the wall is small.
That's a good point to raise, as part-to-whole reasoning can be fallacious. Your example is perfect. Every brick being small doesn't make the wall small. However, part-to-whole reasoning isn't always fallacious. For example, if every single brick in the wall is red, then the wall itself will indeed be red, won't it? The property transfers. The argument here is that contingency, or dependence, is more like the color red than the size small. A collection of things that are individually contingent things that don't have to exist is itself, as a collection, no less contingent. The universe, conceived as the sum total of all contingent things, is itself contingent. Furthermore, many of these arguments, like the Thomistic one from essence and existence, don't actually need to start from the universe as a whole. They can start from any single contingent thing, this coffee cup, this tree, this thought. If this specific contingent thing requires an ultimate cause for its existence, then that cause must exist, regardless of what we think about the universe as a totality. So the argument isn't necessarily dependent on reasoning from all parts of the whole.
Ah, okay. So the property of needing a cause, contingency, does transfer to the collection, and anyway, the argument can work even from a single part. That addresses the fallacy concern. How about the God of the gaps criticism? Or the related idea of scientism, the view that only science gives real knowledge? Aren't these philosophical arguments just trying to fill gaps science hasn't explained yet?
Right, the God of the gaps charge is that religion or philosophy just inserts God wherever science currently has an unknown. We don't know how life started. God did it. We don't know what caused the Big Bang. God did it. But the arguments we've been discussing aren't like that. They aren't hypotheses designed to fill temporary gaps in scientific explanation. They are presented as strict metaphysical demonstrations, arguing for a cause that is necessary in principle, regardless of scientific progress. They argue that even if science could explain every single step in the chain of physical causation back to the Big Bang, you still need a metaphysically ultimate, uncaused, purely actual ground for the existence of that entire chain right here and now. It's addressing a different kind of question, a metaphysical one, not just plugging a scientific hole. As for scientism, the view that only science gives genuine knowledge, the text points out that this view is typically seen as self-refuting. Why? Because the statement, only science gives genuine knowledge, is itself not a scientific statement. It's a philosophical claim about science. You can't prove it using the scientific method. So, if scientism is true, then the statement asserting scientism cannot itself be known to be true.
Huh. So the statement refutes itself.
Pretty much. It highlights that science operates within a broader framework of knowledge that includes logic, mathematics, and yes, metaphysics, which investigates the fundamental nature of reality that science itself often presupposes. Physics, for instance, is powerful, but also abstract. It doesn't give an exhaustive description of reality. It can describe the interactions of particles, but it can't, from its own resources, explain the existence of things like water molecules or consciousness. It has to presuppose them or phenomena related to them to study them.
That puts science in its still incredibly valuable but perhaps not all-encompassing place.
Okay, one more really big one, which we touched on briefly when discussing God's goodness, the problem of evil. How can a good and all-powerful God allow so much suffering? For many people, this is the biggest stumbling block. It is, undeniably. And the text acknowledges the immense weight of this problem. As we discussed, the core philosophical response within this framework revolves around the concept of evil as a privation, an absence of do good rather than a positive thing created by God. Building on that, the arguments often appeal to what's called a greater good, theodicy. The idea is that God, in his wisdom, permits certain evils, absences of good, in order to allow for the possibility of greater goods that couldn't exist otherwise. The classic example is free will. For creatures like us to have genuine freedom to love, to choose the good, to enter into relationship with God and each other freely, we must also have the capacity to reject the good, to choose wrongly, which introduces moral evil and its consequences into the world. A world with genuine free will, even with its risks, might be considered a greater good than a world of puppets who always do right, but without freedom.
So freedom necessarily includes the possibility of misuse?
That's the idea. And similarly, natural evil suffering from disease, natural disasters, etc., might be seen as necessary components of a natural order that operates according to regular laws, which itself is a good, and also as providing the context for the development of certain virtues like courage, compassion, patience, fortitude. How could you develop courage without facing danger or hardship? How could you show compassion without encountering suffering? Now, this doesn't mean we can understand the specific reason for every instance of suffering. The argument is often that we, with our finite perspectives, shouldn't expect to grasp the full picture or God's complete plan, just as a small child often cannot understand the reasons behind a parent allowing them to face a temporary hardship for their long-term growth.
It's an appeal to a bigger picture that we might not fully see. It doesn't take away the pain, but it offers a framework for understanding its possibility within a good creation.
Exactly. It aims to show that the existence of evil isn't necessarily logically incompatible with the existence of an all-good, all-powerful God, even if it remains emotionally and existentially challenging.
And one final objection that sometimes comes up, divine hiddenness. If God exists and these arguments are sound, why isn't he more obvious? Why do so many people not believe? Why the controversy?
That's a fair question. If the ultimate reality is the ground of our being, why doesn't everyone just see it clearly? The response here often emphasizes the nature of the arguments themselves. These philosophical arguments for God's existence, as we've seen, are complex. They require careful thought, rational engagement, understanding abstract concepts. They're not designed to be like seeing a tree in front of you immediately obvious to sensory perception. The fact that an argument is controversial or that it requires significant intellectual effort to grasp and evaluate doesn't automatically mean it's invalid. Think about complex theories in physics or deep mathematical proofs. They're certainly not obvious to everyone. They require study, but that doesn't make them false. So the hiddenness might be partly due to the depth and difficulty of the subject matter itself, and perhaps also due to factors within us, our willingness to engage, our presuppositions, perhaps even moral factors that can cloud our intellectual vision, as some traditions suggest. The arguments are presented as rationally available, but not necessarily psychologically coercive or immediately evident without effort.
So the knowledge is there, but it requires seeking and intellectual engagement.
That seems to be the view presented, yes.
Okay, wow. We have really journeyed through some deep waters here. So taking all this in, what does this deep dive mean for you, the listener? We've seen how rigorous philosophical inquiry, starting from just, looking around at the world, can lead to a remarkably coherent and detailed understanding of an ultimate reality. It paints a picture of a God who is unique, simple, eternal, all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, and crucially, not some distant creator, but the one who is continually sustaining everything in existence right now, at every moment. Not really as an interventionist from outside, but as the very ground of all being and all causality.
It's quite a picture, isn't it? We've explored how seemingly disparate observations from, a changing coffee cup to the parts of a chair to abstract numbers, to the sheer fact that anything exists can actually converge to reveal, or at least strongly suggest, a profound truth about the ultimate nature of reality. Maybe a final thought to consider is this. How does this perspective shift your understanding? Not just of the grand scale of the cosmos, but of the small, ordinary moments in your own life. If everything you experience, every object you touch, every thought you have, is continually being held in existence and enabled by this ultimate, simple, actual cause, what might that imply for the significance, maybe the meaning, of your own existence and your actions within that reality? What else might be illuminated if we start looking for these deeper connections, this underlying ground?
A lot to think about, isn't it? These arguments definitely present a very specific, very rigorous way of understanding reality. For some, they might resonate deeply, seem incredibly compelling. For others, maybe they raise more questions or challenges to assumptions. But it certainly challenges us to look at the world, at existence itself, through a different lens. It's been a fascinating exploration. We really invite you to continue your own deep dive into these fascinating and, let's face it, fundamental ideas.